Welcome everybody to the Oasis Digital Angular lunch. My name is Jack Balbes. I am a instructor with Angular Bootcamp and Oasis Digital, and today we will be talking about forms in Angular 2, specifically template forms versus reactive forms. So I want to get a quick poll from the audience. Who here is using reactive forms? Who here is using template forms? Why are you guys here if you're not using forms at all? Well, the thesis of my talk is that when you get around to using forms, you should be using reactive forms over template forms because you can do everything with reactive forms that you can with template forms, but better. So to illustrate this point, I have created a simple application using the Angular CLI that you see before you with a number of different forms. So on the left over here, I have a set of forms that I can use to filter this list in the middle. So these top two are actually two instances of a reactive form. I created a view component using the smart and view component pair that Paul talked about at one of the previous Angular lunches. And this one is implemented using a reactive form. So as I type into this form, it filters down the list in the middle. And you'll also notice that all of my other filter forms are updated with the current state of the filter. So I have two copies of that going. Now I can use all these various controls and they all update in step with each other. And then these two are implemented using template forms. So as I type into this form here, so notice that the other forms, both the reactive and the template forms, are all updating in lockstep as well, and my list in the middle is also updating. So this similarity of interaction also extends to how I use these components in the software. So if we go and we look at the template for my main component here, so this is my component for the overall app. So I have four components that I'm using, two of the reactive search form and two of the template search form, and both of them just have one, bracket binding in with the current state, and one event binding out for receiving updates from any particular form. So each of these forms have exactly the same interface. So from the point of view of the program, it doesn't matter that one of them uses reactive forms under the hood and one of them is using template forms. So we can focus purely on the implementation of these components to determine which one we think is better. So let's take a look at that. So let's look at template forms first. So template forms are very similar to Angular 1 forms. So the most important part to look at is the template here. So when we have a form on the page, Angular is setting up some extra stuff for us behind the scenes. So to get at the value of this input here on line 6 through 9, I can just stick that ngModel directive on there with that bananas in a box syntax to do a two-way binding. So very similar to Angular 1, if I type into that input box, it will update my model in the class, which we'll take a look at in a second. And then I can use that throughout my program. So, and then these other inputs are essentially the same. I'm using ngModel to get updates about, okay, the user typed in to my input box, now I need to do something. But there's a problem. And the problem is that ngModel doesn't have any way of really notifying me, hey, I set this value, right? So what I'm doing in my component is I'm actually doing a little trick. So I am, if it'll close, actually using ES6 class getters and setters instead of actual regular properties. So that get search term and set search term that's actually standing in for a property. So from the outside, it appears as if it is a regular, JavaScript object property. But internally, whenever somebody sets the search term, that method is called, and I can go ahead and emit an event. So I'm using a little trick to get a window into when my ng model is making updates to my, my model. And I have to do this for every one of my form inputs, right? So then I have, my underlying model that I'm storing all of this information in, and the various setup for this component. So what does my reactive form look like? So the template is pretty simple. So I have this form group that I'm binding to this search form, and then on each of the inputs I have this form control name, which I'm setting to be some name. So the template isn't very complicated compared to the template forms. Let's take a look at the TypeScript. So here, what I'm doing is describing the behavior of the form. So in this case, it's just a few inputs with some default values. So this form builder thing I'm getting via dependency injection. And then I'm saying, hey, please build me this form. I would like it to have a search term whose default value is just an empty string. This include rebels, which is just a Boolean. And include imperials, which is also a Boolean. And then I could do some additional configuration in here. So all of my definition of the behavior of the form is actually in code as opposed to in the template. And we'll see another example of this when we look at that form for adding a starship to the list. So now that I have a handle in my code to the actual form group that is behind this form. So over in the other one, remember how I said that Angular is actually doing some work behind the scenes? Angular is actually doing this process for you when you're using a form and binding to it with ngModel, but you don't have access to it here. You can access it in the template, but it's harder to get to here. Here we're creating it, we can define it all here, and then we can say Angular, here it is, please use this. So now my form behavior is nicely separated from my form look. So then how do we get updates? So a form group actually has a set of observables that we can use to subscribe to changes. So this value changes is an observable that will trigger anytime somebody makes a change to the overall form. So all I have to do here is subscribe to that observable, and then whenever we get an update, we're going to go ahead and emit the new value. So, and then of course we have to be good citizens and unsubscribe later on. So if we take a look at these TypeScript files side by side, we'll actually see that if I scroll down to the bottom here. So I had about 30 lines for my reactive form and about 40 lines for my template form, even though I'm actually specifying most of the behavior of the form for the template form in the template. So it was more concise, even with the not having to specify as much. Okay. So let's take a look at the template side by side real quick. So we got the template search form, the reactive search form. So these, I've got about 25 lines for the template one and about 20 lines for the reactive one. So still slightly shorter. So let's take a look at this other form over here. So this is a form to go ahead and create a new starship in my list, right? So I can say, okay, I'm going to make, the Enterprise, right? But I actually have some validation on this form. So this form, you can only add a ship that has been used by either the Rebels or the Imperials, right? You cannot put in, some other ship. So let's put in, the A-Wing, right? That was used by the Rebels. And then as I click on it and create the ship, there it is. So this one right here on the top right was created using reactive forms. This one on the bottom is exactly the same interface, but again is being implemented using template forms. So if I type in, this is going to be the TIE Interceptor, and it was used by the Imperials. So note the same form validation is occurring. If it's not used by either the Rebels or the Imperials, you can't create the ship. As soon as you do, as soon as it is, then you can create the ship, and it's added in the same way. So they have the same behavior. And then if we go back and we look at that HTML that I showed earlier, the smart search right here. So again, these forms both have the same interface. When you want to create a new ship, they just emit an event that is the new ship to be created. So just like with the filter form, I've implemented the same component with different implementations under the hood, one with reactive and one with templates. I see you squinting. Do I need to make my font size bigger? No.
Not my fault.
All right. So let's take a look at the implementation of the template form. So this is the template create form. So here, remember I said that you can get a hold of an instance of the form control, the form group in the template? That's what I'm doing right there on line 3. So this is saying, hey Angular, please give me the form group that you made to control this form. This used by someone attribute is a custom validator that I have created. Similar to Angular 1, you can make directives that you put attributes on form controls and then they work. So that I'll go over how I did that in a little bit, but this is another validator that I've added. And then here I have a validator on my name control saying that the ship has to have a name of some kind. And again, binding to it with the banana in the box ng model, just like before. And then these guys are the same because they're validated by this validator. So then down here on this button, I am asking, hey, is this form valid? Right, so ship form, this name here, is what I created right there. So I'm actually creating a variable in the template and then referencing it later. So I can get the validity of the form to disable the form, give it a disabled class to make it look disabled. And then when I click to submit it, I go ahead and submit the ship. So let's take a look at the TypeScript. So let's just focus on here. So I have my starship that I am in the process of creating. And then when I go to submit it, I just submit that new ship. And then I clear out the form. Right? This is very similar to how we would do it in Angular 1. But what's interesting about this is actually how I did that validator. So I have this, used by someone validator, which is checking a form to say, hey, is, used by Rebels is it used by the rebels, or is it used by, or if it's used by, or if it's not used by the rebels and it's not used by the Imperials, that's not valid, so we need to return this thing. But actually an additional thing that I need to do here is that because Angular is the one that's responsible for creating this, it actually can call your validator. I discovered this while I was making this example. It can sometimes call your validator before these controls are initialized. So you have to put a check here to say, okay, is this control actually here? If it's not, well, I mean, my form obviously isn't ready yet, so I can just return. And then in order to hook this up to the form, I actually have to encapsulate this inside of a directive. So what we're actually doing here is adding our validator to Angular's list of built-in validators. So this is a multi-provider. So we're saying, hey, this list of validators that Angular has, please add this one to it. And then once that's done, then we can use it in the template up here. So right here. So okay, well that works, but there's a couple of kind of nagging things about this, right? So all of my behavior of this form is really in my template, right? My template is coding the behavior of my form. And we really want to separate those things out. And also, I've got this extra directive that I have to implement, right? And that's something that's going to be now in my whole application. Anytime somebody uses this attribute, that's going to be targeted by that directive. So I've now taken up that namespace for all of my future attributes. And lastly, we're making a variable inside our template, right? That's not great. So if we wanted to hand this off to a designer or something, they're not going to understand what this means. This is gonna cause some issues with trying to figure out, what does this mean? Is this important? So let's take a look at how I implemented the reactive version of this. So in my template, everything is very similar to the previous example. I've created my actual form group over in the TypeScript. So I just say, hey, form, here is your form group with all of your controls all ready to go. Then I have, I can reference that variable to make this disabled or not disabled. And note that I don't have my validators on these elements, so I don't have the must be used by someone validator on the whole form, and I don't have the required validator on the input for the name, because that's actually all behavior. That's going to be specified over in my TypeScript. So if we look at the TypeScript, so to add some extra behavior wasn't actually all that much in terms of code. So here, there's actually a built-in required validator. So validators is coming from the Angular Forms module, the ES6 TypeScript module. And then to add that validator for the whole form, there's this extra object that I can add onto the end, and then I can just give it the function. So if we look at the implementation of this function, it just takes the form group and it accesses the controls, and it says, okay, is this valid or not? And I don't have to do that whole thing with implementing a directive. I don't have to do the whole thing with checking and seeing if these controls are actually there or not, because since I'm using reactive forms, they're guaranteed to be instantiated before the actual validator is run. And then again, emitting the new value whenever we go to create a starship. And then I can tell the form, hey, please set the value of this form to be, the default empty version. So this is resetting the form. So let's do a side-by-side comparison again. So if we look at the TypeScript, so I have about 40 lines for the reactive form and about 50 lines for the template form. And then for the HTML, I have 20 lines for the reactive and 27 for the template form. So not only are we in a better arrangement of our code in terms of logical separation of where things are, but we actually also have removed the lines of code. And I like having less code. So one last advantage of reactive forms is that they also tend to fit better with kind of the more modern style of applications. So in this app, I actually have NGRX going. I have a state management system. And so let me just show you the search reducer here. So this is the reducer that I have for when you are setting a new state for the filter, right? So whenever any of the forms emits a new value for the search, it goes through this function and it just sets the state. But notice that I have to do this clone here. So what do you think is going to happen if I do that? Does anybody have any guesses what that will do?
You reset it, it'll disrupt the, what is being set there?
It'll disrupt what?
When you change the value of the payload later on, it will change it back here as well, the reducer?
Yes, that's exactly right. So this actually manifests itself in a very weird way. So did I get, we'll make sure that so if I type into the reactive forms, right, so if I start typing in here, so note everything updates as normal. But if I start typing into the template forms, something's broken. So look, my reactive forms haven't updated. My template forms have. And my actual state is updating. So this would lead you to suspect, well, maybe the reactive forms are broken in some way, right? But that's not actually the case. Because the semantic of this kind of state system is that when you have a new value, right, if a.payload is different from the previous one, you actually return a whole new object, right? But the template forms don't do that. They just give you the old object with new data, right? They in fact modify that data in place. So what's actually happening here is that the template forms are modifying the object and they're emitting the event properly. But then NGRX is like, well, this is the same object as the one that's already there, so I'm just not going to do anything, right? And so the reactive forms don't get an update, right? There's no new event. There's no changes that are dispatched via your store. And your state does change, but it's changing because your template forms are actually munging that object directly. So it's working, but for all of the wrong reasons. So reactive forms don't have that problem because they have this idea of immutable state kind of baked into them. So there's a whole class of interesting bugs that you won't run into. This actually, I spent a good couple hours staring at this, trying to figure out what was going on. So my conclusion is that template forms, although they may look closer to what you're familiar with from Angular 1, reactive forms are not harder at all, and they're better in most ways, pretty much every way. They're shorter, more declarative, separate out concerns, and they play nicely with other tools that we're using in our Angular applications. So, any questions? Yes?
So why are they called reactive forms?
So, because you're reacting to the changes, right? So it's like what is it? It's the kind of whole observable.
The value changes.
Yeah, the whole observable pattern. Yes.
Not that I think it's necessarily a better way to go, but can't you get a little further with the template forms by just using ng form and one-way binding with it instead of two-way?
What do you mean? Like,
so when you do so when you have the example where you're using the ng form there with
yeah.
the model.
So with
can't you get rid of the bananas and just deal with the value on the ng form?
Oh yeah. So what you could do is you can split this apart, and then you could do something like, ng model.
Oh, I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking leave the ng, the bananas completely out.
So just like this.
Yep. I just started playing with this stuff this week, so I haven't figured out what all is wrong with this approach, but
so how do you get the values out of this?
From your ng form dot value or value changes.
So I guess you could then pass ship form as a parameter here.
It's kind of halfway between the two. I'm not sure that you want to do it, but it does have the advantage that you're not modifying your ship object.
I don't think it's really halfway through. I mean, the template form actually has reactive features. You can do that value changes thing even before you create a template.
Right.
But I haven't seen anything on here that would make me ever want to use template forms. So.
Yeah, but it does avoid the problem of your your state object getting changed, because now the only changes are coming from the value on the ng form.
I mean, he still would have to do the thing he did to guard against something editing behind the scenes.
So if I pass the ship form here, and then I just
you're saying you don't want your model to get, you want to use template form and not let it edit your model?
I'm just an idea. It's not like I'm
Yeah.
So instead of admitting this type storeship here, you admit this.
Well, you would take the form, right? You would take it would be a form group, right? And then you would in here, you would say form dot value.
Right. And then you could reset the form, right thing. Although setting Starship probably.
I think setting Starship would do it.
Same effect, but
yeah.
You form dot reset if you wanted to.
So I am not sure what effect this would have.
It was just an idea I was playing around with, because, like I said, I'm trying to learn these forms and looking into different approaches. And
so, are you aware of any reason to use template forms?
Similarity to Angular 1, easier to learn.
Are they easier to learn, or are they only more similar to Angular 1?
Well, easier to learn because they're similar to Angular 1.
Is it easier to port like Angular 1 so that Angular 2 syntax with the template forms? Is that one of the reasons why they exist?
So you can transport your like templates easier, but you're still going to end up having to do this directive wrapping, and to be fair, you had to do that in Angular 1, so you would be just porting over those directives. So it would be it might have an advantage in that case, but I would say that as long as you're making that change anyway, right? You're re-implementing a directive, you just bring over the function instead, and then use that.
Makes sense. In your reducer, you implied that you might not use the clone. Do you think that the payload values shouldn't be cloned? Because I tend to almost always like clone that model that comes in as the payload, just because there are references that are being passed around.
Yeah, it's
Cause side effects.
I think it's definitely more defensible to put the clone there than to not. So.
Is the clone an improvement over object assign, or is there any reason to use that versus object assign?
I had underscore already, and it was in my head, so I know that in our projects we've used object.assign.
Okay.
So
Essentially, it does the same thing.
yeah.
Takes up a lot less space on the eyes.
That's really all just waiting for the new TypeScript stuff to work pervasively with your tool chain, so you can use the object spread syntax, and that'll totally wipe out object assign.
Yeah, because wouldn't I be able to do it? I would say like return and then
A payload. Yep, that'll be correct when the tooling catches up.
Now that's only a shallow copy, correct?
Correct.
yeah.
As is clone.
That is great.
And object.assign, I think, right? So
So where are you hooking up your dispatching?
so that is in my smart component. So here, the only output that these things take are event bindings. So then in my smart component, I have a function, right? So I have this set search and create ship, which dispatch those actions. And then those are used, or those are bound using the paren bindings. And this is also where I'm getting the state. So yeah.
So if you have like a really giant form that you want to be breaking into multiple sub pieces,
Mhm.
and there's overall logic to make sure like that one section's filled in and the other section's filled in before it can commit, but then there's also smaller logics, right? How
Mhm.
does nesting work? Have you found any differences there? Have you tried out that?
Yeah, so I did look at that. I didn't implement it in this example, but nesting works very similarly, again, because Angular is using the same actual like code under the hood to manage the form. So in your templates, I guess I don't have my template. So in your template you set things up to you arrange your DOM basically to have that nesting structure, whereas in the reactive forms you would set up your form definition to have that structure.
They nest the form groups, and then the validators will propagate all the way up.
Yeah.
Sure.
And that was one thing I noticed. You had a validator on the actual overall form.
Right.
I've only seen them so far in the individual field.
Right. And so I specifically chose that because I wanted to adding an additional validator to each of the individual inputs is pretty common, and so you can it's easier to extrapolate out, I thought, from showing this. Where is it? Oh, I guess this is the template. So got too many files open. So you can easily imagine this is an array, just adding an additional function to this array, and that becomes another validator on that control.
I could have a comment just to keep piling on the evidence for reactive controls here. You notice on line 22, he's creating this form as a property of his class. So what does that enable on templates? Well, he could actually dig into that form and actually use something like an ng4 over the list of controls to dynamically generate inputs based on the defined form in the class as well. That's something that you cannot do with template forms.
Yep. That's a good point. Okay, so any other questions or comments that people have? Everybody seems to be pondering it quite heavily. So the code is all available on Bitbucket. Yes.
I have a question. If I just want to do a single control, should I set up a form, or should I just like do some event bindings on the control? Because like sometimes I kind of just want like a checkbox. And I don't think of it as I want a form consisting of one checkbox. I think I just want a checkbox. Like, am I supposed to use a form whenever I use the form control, or am I only supposed to use a form when something that kind of, subjectively seems like a form?
So thank you for the leading question. You can actually create these individual controls by themselves. So, mind if I pull up the curriculum real quick?
Yeah. Do we have a step?
Yes, we do. So this is the Angular Bootcamp curriculum. So this step right here. So if you just want a single control, you can create it very close to how you would one in a form. So you just get the class from the forms module, and then you can instantiate a new one, and then you can bind it to a input via this form control property. So this gives you all of the reactive form goodness that you would get from a full-fledged form, but for a single control. So, for example, this guy has a value changes that I can subscribe to. So if I do my form control dot value change, or not value changes, value changes, right? So this is an observable that will emit anytime there's a change for that particular control. So I can do it at the form level, and I can also do it at the individual control level.
So it's like a reactive control without a reactive form around it?
Correct.
Cool.
Yeah, the only real difference there is that in the template you reference the control, the object
Right.
itself is opposed to dynamic.
So yeah, so important difference is, notice that here I'm using the brackets because I'm actually handing it the control via a binding, whereas in this version with the full form, I don't use those brackets because I'm actually giving it a name, right? I'm saying this control, or this input, is associated with the control named name or used by rebels in this form group. So that's why there's that difference there.
And just to make sure I have this right in my head, and the example you're about to do there where you're getting ready to subscribe, we do have to unsubscribe somewhere in that component, correct?
This one. So right here, so if we're subscribing here,
Yeah. I assume you need to hold on to a reference to that subscription and then unsubscribe.
yes. So in order to be a good programming citizen, you should do that. Do your part. Clean up the code.
I don't know if this is on topic, but would weak references or weak maps eventually fix this, like the unsubscribe, so that they became, if you could no longer gain access to the function or whatever reference that this was in, you would drop the subscription to something here?
Maybe. I don't know about that.
Fair
So that seems more like a general observables question, or like than a forms question.
And in this case, it'd actually be kind of contrived, because the minute that component would be disposed of, so would your form control, and essentially that there'd be no island references, there'd be no loops and stuff, so just the whole thing would just kind of collapse, even without unsubscribing.
I'll just put that back there.
And the only other comment I'll throw out there is, having done some larger forms now, there are some nice libraries out there with a bunch of canned validators. Angular provides a couple of basic ones, but there's some more deeper ones, like you used to using the old jQuery validator, or whatever, very, very similar to that. There's still a lot of scaffolding code you need to build, I ended up building my own little form over the RAP system to just generate all the typical validation output and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.